Imagine this. You are standing on a rocky hillside, the salt wind cutting across your face, and below you, stretching as far as your eyes can possibly see, is the most terrifying sight in the ancient world. Thousands of warships, Persian warships, their hulls painted dark, their oars rising and falling like the legs of some enormous creature crawling across the water, drums beating, horns screaming. And somewhere behind you, trembling, is the last flickering flame of something the world has never seen before: democracy, freedom, the very idea that a man has the right to govern himself, and it is about to be snuffed out forever. This is not a movie. This is not a legend. This is the Battle of Salamis, 480 BC, and what happened in that narrow strait of water on a single September morning would decide not just the fate of Greece. It would decide the fate of every free nation that has ever existed since. The United States of America, the parliaments of Europe, the courts of law that protect your rights today. All of it, every single bit of it, traces back to what a small, outnumbered, terrified group of Greek sailors did on that one morning 25 centuries ago. So sit back, because what you are about to hear is the greatest story in the history of warfare. And I promise you, by the time we are done, you will never look at the world the same way again. Let us go back, way back, before the battle, before the ships, before the fire. Let us go back to understand why this moment even happened. Because great battles do not appear from nowhere. They are built, brick by brick, decision by decision, mistake by mistake, over years and decades and generations. And the Battle of Salamis was no different. The Persian Empire in 480 BC was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Stretch your imagination across the map, from the edge of modern-day India in the east, all the way to Libya in the west. From the cold mountains of Central Asia in the north, all the way down to the scorching deserts of Arabia in the south. The Persian Empire covered roughly 5.5 million square kilometers. It contained somewhere between 40 and 50 million people, at a time when the entire population of Greece was maybe 2 or 3 million. Think about that. Think about what those numbers mean in terms of armies, in terms of ships, in terms of wealth, in terms of raw crushing power. And at the head of this empire sat Xerxes I, king of kings, the great king, son of Darius the Great. And Xerxes had a grudge, a very personal, very burning, very obsessive grudge against the Greeks, because 10 years before Salamis, his father Darius had tried to conquer Greece and had been humiliated, crushed, sent home with his tail between his legs at a little place called Marathon. You have heard of Marathon. You know the story of Phidippides running 26 miles to deliver the news of victory. But what you may not fully appreciate is what that defeat at Marathon did to the Persian royal family. It was not just a military setback. It was a national humiliation. The most powerful empire on earth had been beaten by a handful of citizen farmers and craftsmen from a city-state so small it barely appears on a world map. Darius never recovered from that shame. He spent the last years of his life planning a second invasion, a crushing, overwhelming, unstoppable invasion, one that would bury the Greeks so completely that no one would ever dare laugh at Persia again. But Darius died before he could launch it, and so the task fell to his son, Xerxes. Now, Xerxes was not a simple man. History has not always been kind to him. The movie 300 paints him as this towering, bejeweled, slightly ridiculous figure, and while that image is entertaining, it misses the reality. Xerxes was intelligent. He was a skilled administrator. He had managed the largest bureaucracy in the ancient world. He spoke multiple languages. He understood diplomacy, economics, logistics. He was a serious ruler, but he was also proud, deeply, almost pathologically proud. And the shame of Marathon hung over him like a shadow from the moment he took the throne in 486 BC. For 4 years, Xerxes prepared. And the scale of that preparation is almost beyond comprehension. He assembled an army so large that ancient sources like Herodotus, our primary ancient historian for this period, estimated it at over 2 million men. Modern historians think that number is wildly exaggerated, as ancient historians tended to be, and put the real figure somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 soldiers. But even the lower estimate, even 300,000 men, is staggering. That is larger than the combined armed forces of many modern nations. He assembled a navy of over 1,200 warships. He built supply depots along the invasion route. He cut a canal through the peninsula of Mount Athos, an actual canal through solid rock, because his father's fleet had been destroyed trying to sail around that headland in a storm. He built 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow stretch of water that separates Europe from Asia, using hundreds of ships lashed together, so his army could walk across the water from one continent to another. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes reportedly had the sea itself flogged with 300 lashes and thrown chains into the water as a punishment. That tells you something about the man's character. That tells you about the size of his ego and the fire of his determination. In the spring of 480 BC, Xerxes set out from Sardis in modern-day Turkey at the head of the greatest military force the ancient world had ever assembled. March to Greece was itself a spectacle of almost theatrical excess. The army took 7 days and 7 nights to cross the pontoon bridges, 7 days and nights of continuous marching, a river of men, horses, camels, chariots, supply wagons, moving in an endless stream from Asia into Europe. People came from villages all along the route just to watch. Some wept at the sight, not from fear, but from the sheer overwhelming impossibility of what they were seeing. And then there were the Greeks. Poor, divided, squabbling, argumentative, passionate, brilliant, stubborn Greeks. Let us talk about them. Greece in 480 BC was not a nation. It was not a unified state. It was a collection of independent city-states, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and dozens of others, each with its own government, its own army, its own foreign policy, its own rivalries and grudges. These city-states fought each other constantly. Athens and Aegina had been at war so recently that the wounds were still fresh. Athens and Sparta had a complicated, suspicious, often hostile relationship. Many Greek city-states had already submitted to Persia, a practice the Greeks called Medizing, essentially accepting Persian overlordship to avoid being destroyed. Thessaly Medized, Boeotia Medized. The oracle at Delphi, the most respected religious authority in the Greek world, gave such pessimistic advice about resisting Persia that many scholars believe the priests had already made their accommodations with the coming Persian order. So how did the Greeks who chose to fight even manage to organize themselves? The answer is barely, and with enormous difficulty, and thanks largely to the work of 2 extraordinary men. The first was Themistocles of Athens. If there is a hero of the Battle of Salamis, and there clearly is, it is Themistocles, and he is one of the most fascinating, complicated, brilliant, infuriating, morally ambiguous figures in all of ancient history. Themistocles was the son of a man of moderate means and a foreign mother, which in Athens meant he was always considered slightly suspect, never fully one of the inner circle of aristocratic families who traditionally ran Athenian politics. He was not handsome in the conventional Greek sense. He was not a great orator in the polished style that Athens admired. But he had something more valuable than any of those things. He had an almost supernatural ability to understand what was actually happening in a situation, to see the real structure of events underneath the noise and confusion, and to act on that understanding with decisive, sometimes ruthless clarity. Themistocles had understood the Persian threat years before most of his fellow Athenians were willing to admit it was real. In 483 BC, a rich vein of silver was discovered at the Athenian silver mines at Laurion. A massive, unexpected windfall. The Athenian assembly debated what to do with the money. The popular proposal was to simply divide it among the citizens. Every Athenian gets 10 silver drachmas, a nice little bonus. Everyone goes home happy. Themistocles stood up and proposed something completely different. He proposed using every single drachma to build 200 new warships, triremes. The cutting-edge naval weapons of the ancient world. Fast, maneuverable, deadly, crewed by 170 oarsmen each. He argued that Athens needed a navy not just to fight the Persians, but to defeat their old enemy Aegina, the island city-state that sat just off the Athenian coast and had been harassing Athenian trade for years. The Athenians voted for it. Partly because Themistocles was clever enough to frame it in terms of the Aegina problem rather than the Persian problem, the Persian threat still felt abstract and distant to many Athenians, but Aegina was right there, immediately threatening, immediately real. So they voted for the ships. And that decision, that single vote in the Athenian assembly, is arguably one of the most consequential democratic decisions ever made. Because without those ships, there is no Battle of Salamis. And without Salamis, there is no Greece. And without Greece, well, we will get to that. The second extraordinary man was Leonidas of Sparta, You know his name, you know his story. 300 Spartans at the pass of Thermopylae, holding the Persian army for 3 days before being betrayed and killed to the last man. And while the story of Thermopylae is often told as pure heroic sacrifice, the military reality is more interesting. Thermopylae was part of a coordinated strategy. While the Spartan-led land force held the narrow mountain pass, the Greek navy fought the Persian fleet at nearby Artemisium, trying to prevent the Persians from using their naval superiority to simply sail around the land force and land troops behind the Greek lines. The Battle of Artemisium was inconclusive. Both sides took heavy losses, but it bought time. Critically, it demonstrated something crucial about fighting Persian ships in narrow waters. The Persians, with their massive numerical advantage, struggled to use that advantage when they could not spread out and surround the smaller Greek fleet. The narrow waters neutralized some of their power, but then Thermopylae fell, betrayed by a local man named Ephialtes who showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans died. The pass was open. The road to central Greece lay undefended. The Greek alliance was in shock, in crisis, on the verge of total collapse. The Persian army poured through the pass. City after city either surrendered or was abandoned. The Boeotians submitted. The Phocians fled. And then the unthinkable. The Persian army reached Athens. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the cultural heart of the Greek world, the city that had stood firm at Marathon 10 years earlier. The Persian army walked into Athens, and there was no one there to stop them. Because the Athenians had done something almost unimaginable, they had evacuated every man, woman, and child. The entire population of Athens, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people, had packed what they could carry and left. They crossed the water to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnesian shore. They went to Troezen and Aegina and any other place that would take them. The old, the infirm, the women and children, the sacred snakes of the Erechthion, even the treasury, all of it moved. The city was emptied, and there is a famous inscription, the Themistocles decree, which may record the actual emergency order that organized this evacuation. Though historians debate its authenticity, the basic fact of the evacuation is beyond doubt. The Persian army entered Athens and burned it. They burned the Acropolis. They burned the temples. They burned the Parthenon, the old Parthenon that stood there before the famous one was built after the war. The holiest city in Greece, the symbol of everything the Greek world stood for, reduced to ash and rubble. And on the island of Salamis, just across a narrow strip of water, the Greek fleet sat and watched the smoke rise. Now the Greek alliance faced its moment of maximum crisis, because the burning of Athens changed everything. It broke the comfortable assumption that perhaps some diplomatic solution could still be found. It proved that Xerxes intended total conquest, total subjugation. There would be no negotiation. There would be no compromise. It was victory or annihilation, but the alliance was fracturing. The Peloponnesian commanders, the Spartans and Corinthians and others, wanted to pull the fleet back to the Isthmus of Corinth, where the land army was building a defensive wall across the narrow neck of the peninsula. Their argument was logical on the surface: concentrate forces, defend the Peloponnese, make the Persians fight on ground of Greek choosing. The isthmus wall would be defensible. The fleet could protect the flanks. Themistocles thought this was catastrophic thinking. If the Greek fleet retreated to the isthmus, the Persian fleet could simply sail around the Peloponnese, land troops on the southern coast, and the whole defensive position would collapse. The only chance, the only real chance, was to fight the Persian fleet now here in the narrow strait of Salamis, where the Greek fleet had actually been training, where the local captains knew every current and shoal and wind pattern, and where the Persian fleet's overwhelming numbers would count for far less. But the other Greek commanders were not convinced. Night after night, the debates raged in the fleet's council of war, and Themistocles was losing. His allies were abandoning him. Commanders who had agreed with him that morning were changing their positions by evening. The political gravity was pulling the alliance toward retreat, and then Themistocles did something that historians still argue about. Something that was either the most brilliant strategic deception in military history or an act of outright treachery, or possibly both at the same time. He sent a secret message to Xerxes. The messenger was a trusted slave named Sisinus. In the middle of the night, Sisinus rowed a small boat across the dark water to the Persian fleet and delivered a message that claimed to be from Themistocles himself. not as an enemy, but as a secret friend of Persia. The message said, "The Greeks are quarreling, they are about to flee, they are planning to sail away in the morning. Attack now. Block the exits from the strait. Catch them before they can escape, and you will destroy them all." Xerxes believed it. Of course he believed it. It was exactly what he wanted to hear. And it made military sense. Why would a Greek commander send false intelligence to help his enemy? Xerxes ordered his fleet to move. The Persian ships fanned out overnight to block both exits from the Strait of Salamis. The Egyptian squadron sealed the western channel. The main Persian fleet took up position at the eastern entrance. When dawn came, the Greek commanders discovered what had happened. There was no longer any choice. There was nowhere to run. The Persian ships were already in position. The Greek fleet was trapped in the strait. And Themistocles, standing in front of the furious, terrified, trapped Greek commanders, essentially said, "Good. Now we fight." The morning of the Battle of Salamis, almost certainly a day in late September of 480 BC, though the exact date is disputed, was one of those mornings that seem to have been designed by fate itself. A cool, misty September morning in the waters between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast. The Greeks were arranged in 3 squadrons, roughly 371 ships total, largely Athenian triremes, but with significant contingents from Corinth, Aegina, Sparta, Megara, and other city-states. The Persian fleet was vastly larger. Estimates range from 600 to over 1,200 ships, though again modern historians tend toward the lower end of ancient source figures. Persian fleet moved into the strait in the grey pre-dawn light, oars dipping, drums beating the rhythm that kept 300 or more warships moving in coordination. And then something happened that the Persians had not fully accounted for. The strait was narrow, far narrower than open water, and as the Persian ships crowded into the channel, they began to interfere with each other. The magnificent numerical advantage that had made the Persian fleet so terrifying in open water became a liability. Ships jostled for position. Communications broke down. The neat lines of the Persian formation began to bunch and disorder as ships at the front slowed and ships behind kept pushing forward. And there was something else. A morning swell, a shift in the wind. The Aegean in September can be unpredictable, and on the morning of Salamis, the wind and the current favored the Greek ships. Persian ships, which were generally heavier and higher-sided, were affected more by these conditions than the sleeker, faster, lower-slung Greek triremes. Then the Greek fleet attacked. The trireme was the supreme weapon of ancient naval warfare. Long, narrow, low in the water, crewed by 170 oarsmen arranged on 3 levels, capable of bursts of speed up to 12 kilometers per hour. Its primary weapon was its bronze ram, a massive bronze fitting at the waterline of the bow, shaped like a horizontal trident. The entire tactical purpose of trireme warfare was to row at full speed into the side or stern of an enemy ship, punch through the hull with that ram, then back water quickly before the enemy's sinking weight dragged your own ship down. Done correctly, it was devastatingly effective. Done badly, it could mean your own death. The Athenian oarsmen were the best in the Greek world. Themistocles had spent years building and training this fleet. The men who rowed those ships were not aristocrats or hoplite soldiers. They were the ordinary citizens of Athens, the Thetes, the poorest class of Athenian society who had previously been considered too low in social standing to have much political or military importance. Rowing a trireme changed that calculation entirely. These men, the ordinary working men of Athens, were the ones who actually saved Greek civilization. Not the generals, not the aristocrats, the rowers. Battle opened with the Greek fleet, according to most ancient sources, actually appearing to back water at first, retreating slightly, drawing the Persian van further into the narrowing strait. Then at some signal, perhaps a trumpet, perhaps a shout, perhaps simply the moment Themistocles judged the time was right, the Greek fleet reversed course and attacked with full speed. The crash of the first ramming attacks was audible from the hillside where Xerxes sat, on his golden throne, watching from above. He had set up a command post on the slopes of Mount Aegelio on the Attic coast, surrounded by his secretaries and officials, fully expecting to watch the annihilation of the Greek fleet and to have his scribes record the names of his commanders who performed with distinction, so he could reward them later. Instead, he watched his fleet die. The chaos in the Persian lines was catastrophic. Ships that had been designed to fight in open water with room to maneuver found themselves hemmed in, unable to bring their full weight to bear. When a Persian ship was disabled or sinking, the ships behind it could not get out of the way in time. Collisions between Persian ships became almost as deadly as Greek rams. The Persians had a higher proportion of heavily armed marines on their decks, soldiers meant to board and capture enemy ships, but in the narrow, chaotic conditions of Salamis, those marines were more weight and less advantage. The Greek triremes, lighter, nimbler, crewed by men who knew these waters, darted in and out of the milling Persian formation. Ram, backwater, turn, ram again. The Greek tactics were fluid, adaptive, aggressive. The fighting went on for hours. The noise, the screaming of the rams hitting wood, the shouts of the rowers, the war cries, the screams of the dying, the drums, the trumpets, was like the sound of the world ending, and on his hilltop throne Xerxes watched it all. He watched his captains struggling. He watched his ships crowding each other, ramming each other, capsizing. He watched the purple-proud Phoenician ships, the best and most loyal ships in his fleet, being torn apart. He watched the Ionian Greek contingents of his fleet, Greeks who had been conquered by Persia and forced to serve in the Persian navy, some of them apparently fighting half-heartedly, some of them actually switching sides in the middle of the battle. He watched, and it was said that Xerxes called his secretaries to him multiple times during the battle to note the names of his commanders, but not, as he had intended, to reward them, to punish them, to record their failures. His scribes worked their styluses in the clay tablets, as the great king's expression moved from triumphant anticipation to puzzlement to cold fury. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, but too good to ignore, that during the battle, the Persian queen Artemisia of Halicarnassus, one of the only female commanders in either fleet, found herself being pursued by an Athenian trireme, and in order to escape, rammed and sank one of her own allied ships. The Athenian captain, seeing her ship ram a Persian ally, assumed she had switched sides and broke off the pursuit. And Xerxes, watching from his throne and not realizing what had actually happened, reportedly said, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." History does not record how the crew of the ship she sank felt about this compliment. The battle lasted the better part of a day. By the time the fighting ended, the Persian fleet had suffered losses estimated at between 200 and 300 ships sunk or captured. The Greeks lost perhaps 40 ships. The ratio is almost unbelievable, but multiple ancient sources agree on something close to these proportions. The sea around Salamis was thick with wreckage, with bodies, with the debris of the greatest naval battle the ancient world had ever seen. The Persian fleet retreated, broken, bloodied, shattered. The myth of Persian invincibility, the myth that had made 100 Greek city-states submit to Xerxes without a fight, was gone, but the war was not over, not yet. The Persian army was still in Greece, still enormous, still undefeated on land, and Xerxes, furious and humiliated, still had to decide what to do next. What happened in the weeks after Salamis is as fascinating as the battle itself. Themistocles, never content to stop playing the game, apparently sent another secret message to Xerxes, this one claiming that the Greeks were planning to sail to the Hellespont and destroy his pontoon bridges, trapping his army in Europe. Whether this was true or false strategy, more likely false, and more complex diplomatic maneuvering, the message apparently influenced Xerxes' thinking. The great king made the decision to personally return to Asia with much of his army. He left a substantial force, perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 men, under his general Mardonius, with orders to complete the conquest of Greece the following spring. This decision was profoundly important. It transformed the character of the war. The full, overwhelming weight of Persia's power was not going to come crashing down on Greece all at once. There would be another year, another fighting season. Time to regroup, time to rebuild, time to find the unity that had been so nearly impossible to achieve before Salamis. Themistocles became the most celebrated man in Greece. When he attended the Olympic Games, or possibly the Isthmian Games, sources differ, every head turned as he walked in. Every eye followed him around the stadium. He received more applause than any of the athletes. The man who had saved Greece was 35 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, the most famous Greek in the world. And yet, and this is the part of the story that still has the power to astonish, what happened to Themistocles afterward is almost as extraordinary as the battle itself. Within a few years of his greatest triumph, the Athenians voted to ostracize him. Ostracism was an Athenian democratic institution whereby citizens could vote to exile a public figure for 10 years, no crime necessary, no specific charge required, just a vote. Themistocles, the savior of Athens, was ostracized. He was forced into exile. He wandered from city to city, finding friends where he could, enemies everywhere. Eventually, in an irony almost too perfect to be real, he ended up seeking refuge in Persia. In the court of Artaxerxes, the son of the Xerxes he had defeated at Salamis, the Persians, who had every reason to want him dead, instead gave him wealth and a pension and the governorship of several cities in Asia Minor. Themistocles died in Persian territory sometime around 459 BC, roughly 20 years after Salamis. Some ancient sources say he died of natural causes. Others say he killed himself by drinking bull's blood rather than lead a Persian army against Greece, as Artaxerxes apparently wished him to do. We do not know which story is true. We know only that he died far from Athens, in the land of his greatest enemies, and that Athens never fully acknowledged what it owed him while he lived. It is one of history's most bitter ironies. The man who saved democracy was destroyed by the very democracy he saved. But let us continue the story of the war itself, because Salamis was not the end. The following year, 479 BC, brought two more decisive battles. First, at Plataea, where the Greek land army, this time with the full weight of the Spartan phalanx at its center, defeated Mardonius's Persian land force in the most significant land battle of the Persian Wars. Mardonius was killed in the fighting. His army was routed. His camp, with all its extraordinary wealth, the gold and silver and silks and luxury goods of the Persian royal court, was captured and distributed among the Greek allies. The soldier who found Mardonius's body reportedly received an enormous reward. The Greek alliance had finally delivered the decisive land victory that Thermopylae had denied them. And on the same day, tradition says the very same day, though this is almost certainly poetic rather than literal, the Greek fleet won another naval victory at Mycale, on the coast of Asia Minor, destroying another Persian fleet and helping to trigger revolts among the Ionian Greek cities that Persia had held under its control for decades. The Persian Wars were essentially over. Persia would never again attempt a full-scale invasion of mainland Greece. The threat that had hung over the Greek world for a generation was lifted. Now let us step back from the narrative and ask the question that gives this whole story its ultimate meaning. Why does Salamis matter, not just to ancient Greece, but to us? Right now, today, in the 21st century, the answer begins with what actually made Athens different from Persia. And this is not just cultural pride or Western triumphalism. This is a specific, concrete, important distinction. Athens in 480 BC was experimenting with something that had never been tried before at that scale. Democracy. Not perfect democracy. Athenian democracy excluded women, enslaved people, and foreigners. By modern standards, it was profoundly limited, but within its limits, it represented something genuinely new: the idea that ordinary citizens should have a direct, decisive voice in the governance of their city. Not just the aristocrats, not just the wealthy, not just those of noble birth, ordinary men of the city. The decision to evacuate Athens, for example, was made by a vote of the Athenian assembly. The decision to build the fleet with the silver from Laurion was made by a vote. The selection of generals was made by vote. This was not how Persia worked. In Persia, Xerxes decided. His word was law. His judgment was final. The difference in decision-making structures between the two sides is part of what explains Salamis. Themistocles, a man of relatively humble origins, was able to rise to the highest military and political importance because the Athenian system allowed talent to be recognized and rewarded regardless of birth. Could that have happened in Persia? Perhaps. Persian history contains examples of talented men of obscure origin rising high. But the systemic encouragement of merit, the structural openness to new ideas and new leaders, was genuinely more present in democratic Athens than in the Persian royal court. And when Athens won, it won as a democracy. The men who rode the trireme benches, the ordinary citizens, the poorest class of Athenian society, had saved the city. That fact had profound political consequences. After Salamis, it became impossible to argue that the thetes, the rowers, the ordinary working men of Athens, were not full and important citizens deserving of political rights. The naval victory democratized Athens further. The power of the aristocracy, already diminished by the reforms of Cleisthenes, was further reduced by the reality that the city's salvation had come from its least privileged citizens, and from the flowering of Athenian democracy in the decades after Salamis came everything else. The Golden Age of Athens, the Parthenon, the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Aeschylus himself fought at Salamis and later wrote The Persians, the oldest surviving play in the Western dramatic tradition about the Persian response to their defeat. The philosophy of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the history of Herodotus and Thucydides, the medical thinking of Hippocrates. The architecture that still defines how we build public buildings today, the columns, the proportions, the sense of monumental civic space. None of this was inevitable. All of it depended on Salamis. A Persian victory at Salamis would have ended the Athenian experiment in democracy before it had properly begun. The evidence of what Persian conquest meant for a Greek city is right there in the historical record. Athens burned, Miletus destroyed, and its population enslaved after its revolt. Persian rule meant taxation, tribute, submission to the will of a king whose authority was absolute and divine. It did not mean the extinction of all culture. The Persian Empire was not uniquely cruel by ancient standards, and many peoples lived tolerable lives under Persian rule. But it meant the end of the specific, extraordinary, never-before-seen experiment that Athens was conducting with self-governance. The Roman Republic, which the Romans themselves understood as inheriting and adapting Greek models of governance, would not have existed in the same form without Greek precedent. Roman law, Roman concepts of citizenship, the Roman Senate, all of these draw directly on Greek political thought, and Greek political thought developed in the specific conditions of post-Salamis Athens. The Renaissance, which rediscovered Greek texts and Greek models of civic humanism and democratic thought, would have had no Greek texts to rediscover if Persia had won. The framers of the United States Constitution read and discussed Athenian democracy, debated its strengths and weaknesses, explicitly drew on its example. Thomas Jefferson owned multiple Greek texts. James Madison's Federalist Papers engaged seriously with ancient Greek political experience. The DNA of Athenian democracy runs directly through the founding documents of the American Republic. None of that is hyperbole. None of that is triumphalist exaggeration. It is a documented chain of intellectual inheritance stretching from a September morning in 480 BC to the present day. Now, there are always complications. There are always things that responsible history requires us to acknowledge. The Greek victory at Salamis did not save some pure, unambiguous vision of freedom for all humanity. The Athenian Empire that emerged after the Persian Wars was itself an often brutal imperial power. It used the Delian League, an alliance nominally formed to protect against future Persian attacks, as a vehicle for Athenian domination of other Greek cities. Athens demanded tribute from its allies. It punished those who tried to leave the alliance. The Athenian treatment of the island of Melos in 416 BC, where the Athenians killed the adult male population and enslaved the women and children after the island tried to remain neutral in the Peloponnesian War, is one of the most chilling episodes in ancient history, made more so by Thucydides' account of the Melian dialogue, in which Athenian representatives explicitly argue that justice only applies between equals and that the strong do what they will while the weak suffer what they must. Democracy in Athens coexisted with a slave economy in which somewhere between a third and a half of the population of Attica were enslaved people who had no political rights and no recourse. The extraordinary philosophical tradition that produced Plato also produced Plato's deeply anti-democratic republic, in which a philosopher king rules without accountability to ordinary citizens. The contradictions of Athenian democracy, its genuine achievements and its profound moral failures, were both present from the beginning, but acknowledging those complications does not erase the significance of what happened at Salamis. It deepens it, makes it more honest, makes it more interesting. History is never pure. Heroes are never uncomplicated. The achievement of the men who rode those triremes was real and profound and genuinely consequential, even if the society they fought for was imperfect in ways we can clearly see 25 centuries later. Let us also talk about Xerxes for a moment, because in all of this story, the Persian side tends to be flattened into a villain, and that is not fair or accurate. Xerxes was not evil. He was the ruler of a civilization that had genuine achievements: Persian administrative organization, Persian religious tolerance under the Achaemenid kings, the Persian postal system, Persian architecture and art, the Persian tradition of incorporating conquered peoples rather than simply destroying them. The Persian Empire at its best was more tolerant of religious and cultural diversity than many empires that came after it. The Jews of the Babylonian captivity were freed by Cyrus the Great, Xerxes' great-grandfather, an act so significant that Cyrus is the only non-Jewish figure in the Hebrew Bible referred to as a Messiah. Xerxes invaded Greece not because he was a monster, but because the logic of empire required the subjugation of the unconquered periphery, because his family honor demanded revenge for Marathon. And because he genuinely believed, not unreasonably, given his resources, that he could win. He could not have known that the narrow strait at Salamis would be his undoing. He could not have known that Themistocles had already played him like a chess piece into exactly the tactical situation where the Greek fleet could fight on equal terms. The Battle of Salamis is, among many other things, a study in the relationship between information and military power. Xerxes had more ships, more men, more money, more resources than his opponents, but Themistocles had better information about the terrain, better understanding of how the battle needed to be fought, and the ruthless clarity to manipulate both his own allies and his enemy into the position where that understanding could be converted into victory. Superior intelligence, in both senses of the word, overcame superior force. This lesson has been relearned throughout military history. Napoleon's greatest victories came from his ability to understand and exploit the shape of a battlefield better than his opponents. Nelson's victory at Trafalgar, 23 centuries after Salamis, shared significant structural features with the Greek triumph. A smaller, better-handled fleet exploiting the confusion of a larger enemy force in conditions that favored seamanship over numbers. The American submarine campaign against Japan in the Second World War was a modern echo of the same principle: a technologically sophisticated, well-trained force using superior positional knowledge to neutralize a larger opponent's numerical advantage. And there is another lesson in Salamis that remains urgently relevant: the lesson of coalition. The Greek fleet that fought at Salamis was not a single unified force under a unified command. It was a coalition of deeply suspicious, often hostile city-states that had spent generations fighting each other and had been forced by circumstance and by Themistocles' persistence into a temporary unity of purpose. That unity was fragile, contentious, nearly collapsed multiple times, and survived largely because one man was smart enough, ruthless enough, and far-sighted enough to understand what was at stake and to manipulate events to prevent the coalition from dissolving before the decisive moment. The parallel to modern alliance politics is obvious enough that it does not need to be spelled out. But it is worth sitting with the thought that the most important naval battle in ancient history was very nearly not fought at all, not because the Greeks lacked the courage or the ships, but because they could not agree on a common strategy. The military history of the world is littered with coalitions that lost because they could not hold together at the decisive moment. Salamis is the counterexample, the rare case where a fractious, divided alliance found its cohesion just in time. Let us also spend a moment with the physical experience of that battle, because when we talk about triremes and strategy and coalition politics, it is easy to lose sight of what it was actually like to be on one of those ships on that September morning. You are a rower. You have been rowing for weeks, training runs, the fight at Artemisium, the evacuation of Athens, all the waiting and uncertainty and fear. Your hands are calloused and your back aches, and you have been living on flat bread and olives and whatever dried fish the supply vessels brought. You did not sleep last night. Nobody slept last night. The news about the Persian ships blocking the exits spread through the fleet in the small hours before dawn, and you lay on your rowing bench and listened to the water and thought about whether you would see the next sunrise. Now it is morning, grey light, salt smell, the mist on the water. You can hear the Persian drums. You can see dimly through the mist the shapes of hundreds of ships, hundreds, more ships than you have ever seen in your life. Your ship, your trireme, is a long, narrow, fragile-seeming thing from the outside, but from inside it is cramped and intimate and familiar, the same two men on either side of you, the same curved wood of your bench, the same smell of bilge water and lamp oil and sweat and salt. the captain calls the stroke. 170 oars hit the water at the same moment. The ship accelerates, you feel it in your chest, in the pit of your stomach, the surge of a trireme going to full speed, the water hissing along the hull, the oar in your hands bending slightly with the strain. The man across from you is gritting his teeth. The man behind you is breathing hard. Somewhere above you, the Marines are clutching their spears and shields and staring forward at the approaching Persian wall of ships. And then there is a sound like the world cracking open. Ram strikes wood and you are thrown forward against your oar, the impact traveling up through the hull and into your bones. And there is water coming in somewhere, not your ship, the enemy ship. The ram has punched through their hull and the sea is coming in. And already your captain is calling the order to back water, pull her free before she takes you down with her. And you are pulling backward with everything you have, every muscle in your body, the oar bending and shaking, and then the ship is free. The ram pulls clear, and you have a moment, just a moment, to see the enemy ship listing, oars tangled, men screaming in the water, before the captain calls the attack stroke again, and you are going at the next target. This is what Salamis actually was. Not lines on a map, not icons moved across a table. It was 371 ships, full of exhausted, terrified, courageous human beings, spending 6 hours ramming and reversing and maneuvering in a space barely 6 kilometers wide, killing and being killed in the cold September water of the Aegean, for a cause that most of them probably understood in the most basic possible terms: home, family, freedom, survival, without the historical perspective to know that they were changing the world. History always looks cleaner from the outside. From where we stand, 25 centuries later, the significance of Salamis is obvious. The chain of cause and effect is clear. The victory looks inevitable. The story looks like it was always going to end this way. From inside it, on that rowing bench, with the Persian drums getting louder and the mist lifting and the enormity of what you were facing becoming clear, it did not look inevitable at all. It looked terrifying and uncertain and desperately, desperately close. The Greeks won by a smaller margin than the historical narrative usually suggests. If Themistocles had not sent his secret message to Xerxes, the Persian fleet might not have moved into position overnight, and the Greek coalition might have fallen apart before dawn and retreated to the isthmus. If the morning swell had been different, or the wind had shifted the other way, the Persian numerical advantage might have been decisive. If Leonidas had not held Thermopylae for those 3 days, buying time, slowing the Persian advance, allowing the Greeks to complete the evacuation of Athens, the psychological momentum might have broken the alliance before Salamis even became possible. Great battles are like that. They look inevitable in retrospect. In the moment, they hang on 100 contingencies, 1,000 decisions, 10,000 individual acts of courage or cowardice or calculation or luck. What makes them great is not inevitability. What makes them great is that in the moment of maximum uncertainty, when everything could go either way, enough people made enough right choices to tip the balance. At Salamis, the right choices were made. The balance tipped. And the world we live in today is the consequence. There are people walking on the surface of the moon, or at least preparing to, who are the intellectual and institutional descendants of the civilization that survived at Salamis. There are courts of law in 100 countries where citizens can appeal the decisions of their governments because of legal principles that trace back to Greek political philosophy. There are universities teaching science and philosophy and history because of an academic tradition that starts in Athens after the Persian Wars. There are plays and novels and films that draw on dramatic structures developed by Aeschylus and Sophocles, and Aeschylus fought at Marathon and almost certainly was at Salamis, and wrote the Persians as both a meditation on the fragility of empire and a barely veiled celebration of what his city had achieved. The ripples from that September morning in 480 BC have never stopped spreading. They are still spreading now. They reached you wherever you are sitting or standing or driving right now. They shape the language you think in, the government structures you live under, the stories you tell yourself about what it means to be free. 25 centuries ago, 371 ships went out into a narrow strait at dawn to save the idea that ordinary people have the right to govern themselves. They won. Against the odds, against the numbers, against the reasonable expectations of everyone watching from those Attic hillsides, they won. And that is why, when anyone asks why ancient history matters, why any of this long-dead, long-vanished world of Greek city-states and Persian kings and trireme tactics could possibly be relevant to your life right now? The answer is Salamis, because Salamis is not just ancient history. Salamis is the foundation stone of the world you live in. Remember the names: Themistocles of Athens, Leonidas of Sparta, the 170 nameless rowers on every trireme. The women and children sheltering on the island of Salamis, watching the smoke rise from their city, not knowing if they would ever go home. They are the reason you are here. They are the reason you are free, and they won.